So this was advertised as a visual essay, but in practice I think I've drawn more on a definition of the essay film that I heard last year in a talk by Godwell Isham of the Otolith Group. That is to say, a film in which subject and analysis coexist in a single medium, a history which uses the seductive powers of its object. So this is going to be an excessive presentation of images for you, but I'd like to invite you to see that not only as a kind of laziness of the word or a shady appropriation, but as a sort of deliberate immersion. This was ambitious. It was an ambitious project to try and create a visual essay, and I've not spent enough time with the images to do that even a little bit of justice, really, except in the fact that I've heavily enrolled the seductive powers of the visual material and their richness, and the capacity to transmit this seductive quality of material through increasingly rich forms of media was what I was interested in exploring. So here are the slide negatives in their current home in the UCL collection. This is them here today, so that's what they look like now, which is pretty much unchanged. And I'm going to claim that they sit at a peculiar and interesting junction between different forms of representation, notably that of maps and that of photographic views, but also at the junction of different intentions for representation, and they were playing with conventions that weren't stable. 19th century geographical visual materials have long been interrogated in terms of their evidential qualities and what news they were seen to be able to give of other places, how trustworthy their accounts might have been. They've more recently been considered closely in terms of their relationship to consumption, exhibition, and 19th century society of the spectacle, and other such studies have interrogated the ways in which they might have shaped Victorian experiences of time and space. So we're going to travel a little through some of those stories, but I'd like to focus on a different facet of the pictures, one that reshuffles some of those associations that have typically been made. Through this slide in particular, named Ortler Spitze, we can explore the sense in which geographical imagery served and serves not only to contemplate and categorise the world, and not only for a voracious consumption of the world through hungry eyes, as it's been called, but also for the anticipation of future events, because these are images that played a role in operationalising future experience. So what are the slides? They are stereoscopic negatives from 1864, presented to the Royal Geographic Society and then stored and largely forgotten. And looking closely at the edges of the positive images provides some clues, some slippage backwards, to the three-dimensional prop that was the basis for this two-dimensional artifice. So you see plaster, bronze, and paper edges at the borders of the images. The process of creating these slides is literally figured by this diagram, which is from a much later period and is metaphorically translating the aerial photograph. But in the story of these slides, Francis Galton's cousin, Robert Cameron Galton, is played here on screen by the giant diagrammatic man. Cameron Galton was the photographer, and he received the models that were delivered to his home. He leant over them, carefully washed and whitewashed them. He adjusted the angle of light. He created scaffolds for the camera in order to carefully erase the Y dimension of the lumpy objects, which could then make a dramatic reappearance, leaping out in staged moments when viewed through stereoscopic lorgnettes, which are also here over here, or squinting magnifiers. This wasn't easy, as stereoscopy functions best with a long view, and although representations of statues and of models were popular, where they were to be visually consistent, some careful manipulation of the surface and of exposure were necessary. So, extensive correspondence between the two households in Worcestershire and in Kensington documents this mission. Francis and Cameron Galton were home modelling a prototype for an industrial procedure. The Galtons were drawing from the resources available to a gentleman amateur photographer and using leverage at the Royal Geographic Society, from whom they borrowed at least some of the relief models. They were working almost literally with string and sealing wax, various domestic assistants in their respective homes, and some metropolitan photographic suppliers. In this way, they were short-circuiting work that had been being carried out professionally over the previous 100 years by Swiss cartographers and relief modellers who'd been experimenting to find adequate ways to represent the particular range of X and Y in their national landscape. And Galton felt they'd failed. Appropriating work so that had been done by these artisans and technicians in the Alps themselves, Galton's innovation was to add one final layer, the doubling sort of depth trickery of stereoscopy. And where the slides have featured so far in scholarly literature, they've been framed in this sense as a shift or a progress in topographic representation. James Ryan cites Galton's pride that these images belong to quite another order of representation, with delicacy of detail far superior to the workmanship of an engraver. But I'd like to note, however, that these were not only promoted as an improvement in representational techniques, but also as a more widely legible one. Although this was 20 years earlier than the general craze for models and appliances in geographical education, Galton was making the claim that his stereo views would make a better understanding of topography for the general public. And as Murchison, the president of the Royal Geographic Society, stated when he brought the photographs before him, as a geographer himself, this is Murchison, he had no difficulty in thoroughly understanding the altitudes, depressions, and all the physical features delineated in the ordinary way on a really good map, but he quite admitted that a good model conveyed to the general observer a more distinct impression. Simultaneously, in the early 1860s, stereoscopy and mountains were meeting in other places. William England, photographer for the London Stereoscopic Company, had left the firm and begun to work freelance, beginning his personal portfolio with a stereo card series of the Alps. In 1862, the LSC sold 1 million stereoscopic views, and stereoscopy was well on its way to being the huge industry that it would become. Pictures of the Alps by William England and his contemporaries have been and are being analysed as part of the genre of armchair tourism, a peculiarly kind of immersive form of geographical consumption. Stereoscopes played an important role in bringing pictures of the world into Victorian homes, part of the culture of imperial spectacle. And the slogan of the London Stereoscopic Company was, in fact, a stereoscope in every home. But not all of the purchasers of these views were intending to stay in their armchair, and a critique of the Alpine stereoscopic views by the British Alpine Club, who had just formed in 1857, suggests another purpose for these pictures. In their words, by the untravelled eye, indeed, Mr. England's work might fairly be judged the best of all, for his pictures excel Braun's both in perfection of workmanship and in artistic grouping. The mountaineer, however, will for the present prefer Braun, who very often seems to take a view simply for the topographical detail included in it, so that a collection of his pictures contain a large store of information valuable to the intending climber. And this resonates with Galton's suggestions for the use of his stereoscopic views, which is as illustrations for handbooks. And he says, the stereograph of the Ortler Spitze, the one we saw at the beginning, well represents the character of such a district map as may be found commonly inserted in guidebooks where they occupy a single octavo page. These could, at a moment's notice, be viewed with the common eyeglass stereoscope carried in the waistcoat pocket. And the 1850s and 1860s were a time of rapid expansion in guidebook publishing. By 1863, the year of the first Thomas Cook tour to Switzerland, visitors to the Bern Oberland, so interestingly, probably to the zoological gardens with the large dogs, the visitors to that area numbered several thousand a year. And the role of books like Baedeker was explicit. It was to prepare people for visits rather than to relay accounts of accomplished visits. And the visual components of these books served to augment that function. So as the Switzerland Baedeker of 1861 puts it, the maps and plans will enable the traveller at a glance to select the best routes. So whilst the Swiss topographers had been working hard to produce some of the most celebrated 19th century topography, the maps and plans in the guidebooks were not, of course, necessarily produced to the same standard, and where they dealt with some of the more spectacular areas of the Swiss Alps, they were quite visually clumsy, and the slides presented a promising alternative option. Now, Galton's motives for suggesting improvements to the visual forms of travel planning were not disinterested, because Francis Galton was the anonymous author of John Murray's Knapsack Guide to Switzerland, which he published the year before he presented his stereographs. And so here we see Galton's sketches informing Murray of how he would like his routes to be laid out. And the Spectator's review of the Knapsack Guide from April of the same year lays out clearly what kind of traveller the guide was aimed at. So not the leisurely traveller, gentleman and scholar whose tendency was to self-improvement and was prepared to take a bulky volume, inconveniently swollen by a mass of information on geology and botany. This was instead for the 3/4 of the young Englishmen, and in this case women, who leave Oxford and Cambridge or the Temple every autumn with a knapsack on their backs, for the hasty tourist who wants to scamp Switzerland in 4 weeks, seeing all the things that people talk about. And importantly, the Spectator review noted that Galton's knapsack guide requires to be supplemented by a good map. So the visual experimentation of Galton and his cousin then, in late 1864 and early 1865, need to be seen in this light, I think, rather than that of sedentary consumption or of accurate evidence. But they're more than straightforward route finders. The slides sit at a juncture between the history of the map as a navigational device, touristic consumption and domestic technologies. These visual materials support Ulrika Spring's description of cities and countries being reduced to linear routes by guidebooks. They participate in transforming travel from the realm of unknown unknowns to the realm of the known unknown, and they prefigure a tourist who is working with timetables, hotel descriptions and maps as devices that operationalised a future experience and provided measures or checks that gave a metric against which journeying, and more particularly bourgeois travel, could be qualified as successful. And in this sense, they correspond more closely to visual aids within military intent to action than with the history of observation and objectivity. And they're an endeavour that placed Galton, as a gentleman scientist, in the age of industry and universities, attempting to straddle the growing scientific aims of the RGS with the requirements of the middle-class tourist, through reconfiguring a capitalist industrial technology harnessed to domestic purposes into a new aid to successful touristic action in the field. That's the up. Thank you.